First of all, I want to thank the committee for inviting me to be speaker today. Second, I want to thank Doug for shaving about 50 years off of my life. That is the nicest thing anyone could ever say to me. And then I want to talk a little bit about the invitation that I got, a little bit where I was. About a year ago, I had been at a conference, and one of the highlights, it was a huge conference, 10,000 training and development specialists, and that's the area of technology that I primarily specialize in. Higher ed's my second specialty in terms of education. And they were about to present an important, and I put that in quotes because those were their words, an important study of instructional design practice. I was like, oh wow, I have to go because I'm an instructional designer at heart. And one of the highlights of this report was they were going to talk about emerging trends and technologies. And like I have done ever since I first got into this field, I was like, I have to know what they are because I need to be on the leading edge because that's what we do. We have to be on the leading edge. And so I went and I sat, and it's a breakout session, but it was in the largest room that they had. And there were approximately, I figured, about 500 people in that room. There was seats for 1,000, but about half of them were full. And there were a bunch of people on the front of the stage, and it wasn't an academic study, it was by two professional associations, and they had a professor who helped them with it. And it's important that it was done by professional associations because this is the stuff that people look to decide, what am I supposed to be doing with my career? What technologies and trends do I need to be familiar with to be relevant in my career? So with great trepidation, I waited, and I saw they had 14, and these are the top 5. Designing content for use in various cultures and regions, storytelling, infographics, learning analytics, and virtual simulation and game-based training, game-based learning. So let me put some things into a little perspective, because I want to put you where I was in my frame of mind about a year ago. I had actually been working on a study. We were looking at 50 years of the main magazine of the first sponsor of this study. And we've been going through not every issue, but almost every issue. We had a systematic way of choosing the articles. And we were looking at whole issues to see what was covered. We were identifying the topics, the authors, and taking lots of researcher notes, which was the most fun part of it. And the first thing they say is, designing material for content for different cultures and regions. And I was like, what in God's name is new about this? I had just finished analyzing the April 1970 issue. That was the lead article of the first sponsors. Like what? They don't even look at their own thing. And the hardest part of this was they said that one of the key parts of their methodology, they did a literature review, then they did a focus group, and then they did a survey. I remember the survey because I actually took it. But they did a literature review. It's like, what do you mean you didn't know what you actually published yourself, like in 1970, which was 45 years? Granted, and some of them were 45 years or older. Okay, the ones who were like 1 when they were born, I give them. But some of them were like in their 20s in 1970 and really had the opportunity to read that publication. So I went to my co-author on my study, and I said, you know what, I know we're working on this, and I know we're working towards something big, but we have to stop. We have a social responsibility here. We need to go through every one of these trends because people are telling people that these trends, people are going to read this report and they're going to think these are important trends. And the truth is that every single one of them we have seen in our research. And I think what we can do is we just, the basis say, look, even though they said they did a lit review, we're going to let them off easy. We're just going to say, if they just look at their own stuff, because you know what? It costs money to go to EBSCO, it costs money to get a magazine subscription, but it doesn't cost you money to go to your own file cabinet. And all we have to do is find evidence that they knew about it, that it should have been known to them because it was in their stuff. And so we started with the culture, and these are just some of the references that we found. And we looked at what happened. And what we did see was really interesting when we're looking at designing culture. In the 1970s, there were really 2 distinct themes. One was just come out of all of the social turmoil of the 1960s. There was a lot of emphasis on working with different cultural communities within the US. And then there were also people who used to go abroad, because there was a lot of sending of people abroad to work as trainers or training and development specialists in other countries, and what training was like in those countries, or what it was like to be an expat in those countries. And what has changed now from our look at other work is that it's not that writing for different cultures has changed, but what happened was that the dominant type of training back in 1970 was classroom, face-to-face, like me, you kind of thing. Now, about 40% of all instruction in the workplace is done by a computer. 25% is asynchronous. Another 15% is moderated by technology. Some of it's blended. Some of it's live virtual training. And so what happens is that a lot of that computer-based training is being translated into other languages, and that it has to be localized for the different cultures. Not a completely different concept, but the idea of translation and localization are slightly different concepts. And that did not get reflected in this report, and it wasn't in the oral report, and it wasn't in the written one. Nor did that transition between the old themes and the new ones come up. The next theme was storytelling. And I don't know what was new about storytelling. That's how we taught before we even had the written word. But I can conjecture what might be new about storytelling. Used to be, back in the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, and a little bit in the 2000s, the job of the instructional designer was to prepare a course for someone else to teach. So when there was a story to be told, it was the instructor's story. Sometimes we'd say, stick a story here, to give them a little help about when to do it, but we didn't know their stories because it was their story, not ours. Once again, because now we're going to scripted e-learning, what happens is that we now have to provide that missing story. We're also seeing the rise of interest in various storytelling-based teaching techniques like problem-based learning or case-based learning, none of which are actually new, but there's renewed and growing interest in them. And there's a really important distinction between those. And once again, we were able to find references. This is just a small list of them. Infographics. Now, that's a new word. I'll give you that. It's a new word. But it's not really a new concept, and there are really two pieces to it. The first thing is the device of the infographic. And that was actually mastered, I don't know who did it originally, but I know it was popularized back in the 1980s by this newspaper called USA Today, which most Americans will be familiar with, because they went to a more visual type of journalism to begin with, and on top of that, they also went to limited amount of text, because they know most people didn't like jump to page 43, now jump to page 67, now jump to page 83. Annoyed people, so they basically wrote to fit instead of making it fit to publish. Not the content, just the length of the content. So that's one piece of it. The other piece is something called visual communication. So what happened was we got lost in a particular device, and we got lost on terminology. And this issue of terminology is really, really important, because what happens is that we call one thing something one day, and then we call it something else another day. Give you an example. How many people are familiar with the term e-learning? All right, how many people know at least one other term for e-learning? Raise your hands high, be proud. How many know two terms or more? 3 or more? 4 or more? It wasn't really until about 10 or 12 years ago that we actually came to consensus on e-learning. It's been through the following names. It was computer-assisted instruction for many years, except for those of us in training, it was computer-based training, because we can't use the same words as everybody else. Then it became web-based training for a short time, technology-delivered learning, and then somehow or other it became internet-based learning, and then e-learning. So we have a lot of terms, and the problem is if you don't know all the terms, you're not going to find things. And because they were using the word infographics, they weren't looking for visual communication. And visual communication, as you can see, has been covered quite widely for a long time. Once again, here's what's different. When we were doing training back in the 1970s, we were designing materials for classroom instructors. At that time, they had this amazing device called, I don't know, the transparency machine, or the, we used to call it foil machine when I was at IBM. And because they couldn't use the terms that everybody else used either. And what was interesting was that because it was the image was projected, it's the same thing that happens with PowerPoint slides. The primary means of communicating is the visual. The problem is that most of us use it as a teleprompter. And so we put all of our text as for the instructor on there because we're afraid they won't say something. So if I put it on the slide, they'll read it word for word to everybody, which we know makes the essence of great instruction. As we move to e-learning and they go to the scripted e-learning, one of the things that we know, thanks to the popular books, E-Learning and the Science of Instruction, is you're not supposed to put the words that are narrated on the screen at the same time that you put all the words that are coming out of the mouth of the narrator, even if you don't see the mouth moving. So what happens is that you need a really great visual presentation. And so that's why visual communication becomes important, because now, even though we've been saying for years, visuals these slides really have visuals that are supposed to carry the message, we now actually have to eat our words and actually turn them into visuals. And so that becomes really important. And the other thing that's different from the 1970s is they actually had this personal staff called the graphic designer or the illustrator. And you would tell them, I want a visual, and they would produce it for you. Now we have this amazing thing. Instructional designers, they're their own artists. I don't know if we went to art school, but we go to clip art galleries, we fake it, whatever. But we're doing the work ourselves. So that's what's different. It's not that the principles have changed. It's that the job has changed. But that didn't get reflected in this study either. Then came learning analytics, and I know there was a keynote on Tuesday about this. And if we just use the word analytics, once again, it's a short history. But the problem is it's not a short history, because what we're using analytics for is as a means of understanding instruction. And that usually comes in two places. The anal for analytics comes from the word analysis. Actually, analy comes from analysis. So it means how can we use this data for a more informed analysis? And then the other piece of it is how can we use it for evaluation? And when we look at it from those terms, we actually have quite a history. And in fact, in the 1970s, there was some substantial writing about learning evaluation, at least in training and development. It was quite thorough. It was quite methodical. And in fact, it was probably, my co-author and I basically came to the conclusion it was probably more thorough in the 1970s than what they're doing now in terms of the way they were advising people to do things. But once again, by only focusing on what was different as opposed to what had come before, we're telling people that something is completely new when it's not. And that gets me to the fifth one. Virtual simulation and game-based learning. They were actually two separate things. But back in the 70s and the 80s, we actually used to combine them together. And the reason is that simulation and gaming have a relationship to each other. They don't always have to be worked together, but the idea is simulation is a model of an environment, and gaming is what happens when you work in an environment and you see the impact of your actions. If you make a good choice, you get positive, ideally, benefits. You make a bad choice, you get, in a safe environment, get to see what happened. Somehow or other, the idea of the gaming piece is separated out. But what happened is that when we look at virtual simulation and gaming, if you just do the simulation, it goes back to the 70s. If you add the virtual, that comes back in the 1980s. I think the other thing that's really kind of interesting, that didn't get mentioned in the study, but is a common topic in a lot of training magazines, is that we need to teach everything through games, because millennials, that's how they learn. One of the articles we found was in 1985 and said you need to start teaching everything as games, like Pac-Man, because all the kids born from 1965 afterwards all play Pac-Man. How many of you were born after 1965 and before 1985? Do you still learn by Pac-Man? In other words, we have a long history of writing about these topics, but we're not really spending a lot of time thinking about them. And as they went through the other ones, the thing that really shocked me was they made a big point of talking about this, and they didn't really mention at any great length this little tiny line that shows up in the executive summary, but nowhere in the detail of the written report. And that is that most people weren't using any of these. They weren't affecting anyone's practice. And to give you an idea what I mean by not anyone, 10 of the 14 had fewer than 49% of people who said that they were sometimes affected by those quote-unquote emerging trends and technologies. Some of them, it was as high as 3% were affected by them. And if they'd done their research and their lit review, I don't know why any of these were on the chart. On the one hand, I felt hoodwinked. On the other hand, I felt like I should have known better. I've been in this field long enough, even though apparently I'm not. I don't look it. I've been in this field long enough. I've seen these cycles come over and over and over again. What's happened is that we're focusing primarily on technological change. And I understand that many of us here were technology-based people. But if you look at the actual definition of educational technology from the Association for Educational Communications and Technology, the technology is just a piece of it, and a small piece. And there are other changes that we have been through over the past century, profound changes, that really do affect teaching and learning, and the environment for using technology that we're not looking at. Give you an example, the economic changes. Believe it or not, even though there's a ton of uncertainty out there, there's some good news to begin with. And that is that over the last 30 or 40 years, we have lifted more people out of poverty on Earth than at any time in history. But the bad news is those of us in developed economies are not necessarily seeing all of the positive impact of that, because other people are able to do our jobs now, and our jobs are moving. Our parents, our grandparents, they had one job for a lifetime. That's not how we're going to be employed today. It's not since the 1990s that's been changing. And as a result, there's this fear that begins with, how am I going to stay employable? And we don't address that much. There's a really fascinating study of people in the communications industry in the UK who have gone from permanent employment in organizations like the BBC to what's called contingent or casual employment, where they're actually technically working for themselves, but they're back at their own employer as contractors and consultants. And they spend so much of their emotional and physical energy just looking for work that it's really hard to always do the job that they want to do. We've been through profound social changes, too, in the last 50 years. We've seen the removal of all kinds of legal barriers to discrimination. I'm not saying everyone has been removed. I'm not saying attitudes have been completely changed. But we look at the way that certain people who are traditionally discriminated against can live now. It is markedly better than it was 50 years ago. Does it have some place to go? Absolutely. But is it where it was? Absolutely not, for many of us. And that's a good thing. But when people who were discriminated against in the workplace and couldn't steal our jobs from us, now we're able to do our work, that's a different issue. Or when people come to the workplace with different values than we have, that's a different issue. And that's not easily solved. And in fact, one of the horrifying findings for me from recent research is a lot of the educational efforts, especially with adults, that were meant to help aren't doing the job. And I don't know that they will do the job. For example, if you do diversity training, you will sit and learn about how to be nice to people who are not like you. Needless to say, with that kind of environment, it doesn't work to begin with. And what they find is that if the boss actually discriminates, even after they've sent everybody to diversity training, doesn't exactly help, because the culture doesn't really conform to what's going on in the workplace. And what they're trying to give them training, And so what happens is, and these are principles that we know about from training. We know that you have to make sure that the environment is ready to learn what you're about to teach. And if it isn't, you can teach till you're blue in the face. Nobody is going to learn, because what they learned in class and what they experience on the job are polar opposites. And they're going to go with what's on the job, because that's how they keep their job. And that's really important. I think in schools and in universities, we have an opportunity to make a bigger change in that area. And that's really, I think, where a lot of the focus needs to be, but that's just personal opinion. But what happens is we've lived through such profound social change that on a visceral level, just like I was when I wanted to hear about these changes, all of us want to make sure that we want to be on the leading edge of change, because we don't want to be left behind by it. But I think the other thing is there's a principle that we can also take, again from instructional design, the human performance technology piece of it, and that is the basic principle. The best predictor of future performance is past performance. So when we're looking at new technologies, if we are able to link the new one to the one that it may be replacing, and in many cases the technology is replacing something, it's not necessarily a brand new technology. One of the things that we can do is we can anticipate, well, what might come forward? And when we think about that, it's not just the technology we need to look at. We need to look at the entire context in which that technology exists, and the entire context in which that technology has been implemented in the past. And so what I thought, in that frame of mind, when they said, well, what would you like to speak about? I was like, well, let's take a walk back through these technologies, because there's a story there, and I think we can learn from them. I think the first story that we can learn is that there's a hype cycle. And many of you are probably familiar about it. We actually use it. I've seen this a lot I didn't learn this on my own. I heard about it at a conference like this one. And you start off with the technology trigger, the peak of inflated expectations. And we've seen that a lot in the last 5 years with some technologies. The trough of disillusionment, and then finally the plateau of productivity. We know that exists, but I think we can look at technologies when they're in the trigger or the peak of inflated expectations, and being educational technology researchers and analysts. I think we can be a little bit more analytical about the technologies based on previous history instead of merely being cheerleaders. And so what I'd like to do is actually go through a number of different technologies, some of which you probably have heard of and been excited about, some of which you probably don't think about at all. And then I'm going to give some thought about whether they were revolutionary or evolutionary. And the first one is computer-based instruction. And I use the old word instead of e-learning because that's the term it was introduced in. And anybody want to just fathom a guess when the concept first started to hit? Want to fathom a guess? How many people want to say the first time we had computer-based instruction was the 1990s? 1980s? 1970s? 1960s? 1950s? 1940s? The concept actually was first proposed during World War II. It didn't become operational until the 1960s. By the time I started my career in 1980, it's the first time I've ever admitted that publicly, but the first time when I started, I spent the first 7 months going to a computer-based training lessons in a lab every single day. They were taken on a green screen tube, which some of you may have only seen in historical pictures. Some of you may not have even seen them, but you will later. And we had ASCII characters, which meant there were no fancy graphics, but the nice thing was they never had more than 3 or 4 lines of text on the screen. Now, when we're dealing with computer-based instruction, what happened was everyone was very enthusiastic. At first, it was truly experimental. But when the personal computer came about, everyone said, this is the next big wave. Some people say, yeah, I remember that. And there were a couple of barriers that nobody even to this day really talks about that affect why it wasn't going to be such an easy implementation. The first thing was that we really didn't have easy authoring systems. In fact, I worked for an employer that actually put out an easy-to-use $49 authoring tool that they sold in B. Dalton booksellers. And then they replaced it with a $2,000 one. And they pulled the $49.95 one out, so people couldn't write their own tools. And by the way, to use the $2,000 tool, that was $2,000 per PC, you had to have programming skills because it was a tag-based system. The first really popular graphical user interface authoring tool was Authorware. It sold for the wildly reasonable price of $8,000 US when it was first introduced. But here's my favorite part. That was just for the PC of the author. If you wanted to use it on a PC, that was another $50 for each PC that you were going to use on. It was called a viewing license. At those costs, nobody could afford to do e-learning. Here's the other piece of other number that people don't really think about when doing e-learning. Anybody know how much time it takes to develop one finished hour? I'm just giving you the training number. Anybody want to guess how much time does it take to finish one finished hour of instruction, e-learning the way we think it should be done? Let's say, a reasonable amount of graphics, maybe not much video or no video at all, but really interactive, lots of questions, personalized learning paths, and so forth. Anybody want to guess how much labor is required for one finished hour of that? 100 hours, 40 hours. Double yours, and back in the 1980s, add another 25 to 30 hours for a basic, for a fully implemented, full motion, multimedia production. Back in the late 90s, early 2000s, it was 450 hours, and I even heard by one provider, it was 1,600 hours and counting for one, it was a full simulation for one finished hour. That's a lot of labor that's required. Let me give you a contrast. Anyone know how much time it takes to develop 1 hour of instructor-led instruction for training? Anybody want to fathom a guess? 40 hours. 40 hours versus 225. When you're paying for labor by the hour, it's like going to the grocery store and you're looking at the Chex cereal and you're saying, Walmart's great value is $1.99 and they want how much for the wheat Chex? I think the Walmart really is a great value for the money. And so when you're dealing with things that are really, people are very sensitive to the budgets, e-learning is not an option because it's so much more expensive unless you have the number of students to warrant that kind of investment. And it's something that we haven't thought about. There are other issues with e-learning. And by the way, excuse me, before I finish this subject, one other thing I wanted to mention. Anybody know what the advice is? And I've only heard it from one school, but I think it's an assumption in many others. What the advice is for an instructor who's teaching classroom in a university. How many hours of prep are you supposed to do for 1 hour of instruction? It's a 1-to-1 ratio. So when you're looking at, let's just say 225 hours of development for 1 hour of finished instruction versus 1 hour that I don't even have to pay any extra for because it's part of your salary, once again, one of the challenges is economic. But that's not the only one. We had other challenges with e-learning. One of the biggest one is the area of trust. We trust e-learning because that's what we're paid to do. Most of us don't get paid to it because it's not just a pay, we believe it. But if you go out there, most other people don't. I had a friend who was writing a book, and so he was writing a book about e-learning, he published it, I said, well, I'll buy it to support him. So I'm reading the book, he says, this is published in the last 4 years. He starts off saying, I came from background in technical communication, which is technical writing and editing. It's my background too. And he was moved over into an adult ed program. So we have very similar backgrounds. I think this is kind of interesting, starting off on the right foot. And he said, and I was being asked to teach distance. So I was going to do a book about how, whether e-learning was effective. And all of my colleagues supported me because they wanted to know whether e-learning was effective because most college faculty, most university faculty don't. By the way, most training faculty didn't until very recently. And I was like, my God, why is he doing this? My colleague, 10 years before he even started this book, did a meta-analysis that basically just said, stop the discussion, it's effective. I should have read further. He goes, I started to do the research. I went to do a lit review. At 9,000 studies, I stopped counting. This study is, and it's abundantly clear. The problem is it doesn't matter how many studies we do. What people know in their head and what they know in their heart are not the same thing. They have to experience it. And one of my favorite experiences as someone who advises people on e-learning, you always hear from people who don't have experience it. I will have no contact with the student. I said, that's the conversation of someone who was never taught online. Two things I've noticed as an instructor online is my colleagues, first of all, it's like, my God, will they stop bothering me? You have plenty of contact. And the other thing, and then so the next line is, but you have no meaningful contact. I said, I don't know. I had a student who disclosed that she was in a halfway house after being released from prison for a felony, and she could only take courses at work because she had no access to a computer in the halfway house. I don't know about you, but to me, that's kind of disclosing a fair amount. I had another one who disclosed, it was a certificate course for a professional association. She'd been diagnosed with cancer, stage 3, and just finishing this course was really important to her because it was an important part of her recovery. So people that don't believe that you can have that kind of relationship, you can have these very deeply human relationships. Then there's the third one. Well, there's certain kinds of courses that work better online. And you probably have heard that one too. The reality is you can teach anything online if you want to, and if you're creative enough. By the way, when the studies were done that said e-learning was as effective as the classroom, it didn't say the courses themselves were effective. What it said was is that if they were crappy in the classroom, they were equally crappy online. And I think we have to be really careful about that. So we can always do better as instructors. But we also have to recognize that in the classroom, it takes people years to develop a number of repertoire of techniques that they're comfortable with and that they can use. Now you move them out of the familiar environment into another one. All of a sudden, you have to retrain them and rebuild their confidence. We don't always take that. We talk about implementation, but we don't always take some of these very human concerns into account. And then there's one last thing that we never pay attention to. What has been the actual use of e-learning in the different environments that we do? Because that has a bigger issue. In universities, it was growing pretty fast, but in the last couple of years, it appears to have plateaued, and it's about 15 to 20% of enrollments are virtual enrollments these days. And it seems to be plateaued at that for the time being, and I have a feeling that many administrators are reasonably happy with that. In training, I was actually started tracking the training usage back in the 1980s. And the question they used to ask on the only survey that tracked it was, do you use any of these media in training? And so if you'd used it for one course once in the year, you got to tick the mark off. And in that case, and back in the 80s, it was about 33% of organizations had at least one, what they call computer-based training program at the time. I actually started working for the people that did that, and I asked them, can you change the question from, do you use it, to what percentage of your portfolio is in that medium? And then it went from, at that point, it was the early .com years, it had risen up to about 40 to 45%. It dropped down to 10 to 15%. Because it's different between whether you use it to how much of your portfolio is in it. And after that, there was a second major study that was done annually of the industry and how much they were using the various technologies. And what they found was that adoption of e-learning was going up to about 25% asynchronous, and then there'll be another 15% usage of technology, whether it be for hybrid learning, partly online, partly classroom, or live virtual training. And it seems to be settling at 40 to 45%. But there's another number that's really important. One of the big cases that trainers have used to say, why don't we invest in e-learning, is that you'll save on training costs. And part of it's you won't have to do the classroom training, part of it's you won't have to pay the travel to training. Companies got the message. And during the last recession, in this country alone, investment went from about $1,200 an employee down to $800. And it has barely recovered ever since. And that's a serious problem, because employers are not investing in their workers. That's not a Canadian-only issue. Believe it or not, although the Brexit is getting all the news in the UK, there's a law coming out in the UK that I believe it takes effect tomorrow that says all employers will contribute 1% of their, I believe it's payroll, to a fund for apprenticeship. And the reason is, and this is from a conservative government that usually doesn't like to impose these things, because employers were not spending sufficiently on training their employees. And so one of the issues that we have to deal with is, the use of technology, how is that affecting spending? And are we spending so little that we're not even providing the bare minimum? And these are important questions that we don't always ask, because we don't track. We may track the number of people use it, but we don't track, well, what does it mean to people? So the verdict, is it really revolutionary? If it took almost 50 years to get to where it is, I'd say it was more evolutionary. Let me look at a second one. I'm going to go through the next several ones much more quickly. Learning objects. They were really hyped about 15 years ago, and the idea was that I would be able to create an object myself, and another designer in someplace else, maybe has no relationship with me, could use that object and train. And we would send information back between the different objects so that if the learner had a particular learning need, the other object that I never had anything to do with could pick up on that need and address it. Really great idea in theory. There were some problems in practice. First one was you need standards for interoperability to make that happen. So the US Department of Defense came up with something called SCORM that many of you have heard about. And everybody calls it a standard, but the people don't realize that SCORM isn't just a weird name. It's an acronym, and the last two letters are reference model. And those are really important words because it's not a standard. So you could design to meet SCORM, And the problem was it still didn't work and send information back and forth. So that immediately made some of the interoperability problems an issue. A lot of instructional designers also were uncomfortable with it because they refused to define exactly what an object was. It was too broad. It could be a picture, it could be a unit, it could be a paragraph, it could be a word. Well, that's great in theory. The problem is most of us don't work at the conceptual level, we work at the tactical level, and we want something practical, concrete, and just give me a real definition. Don't give me this fuzzy-wuzzy kind of thing. But perhaps the third one was there was an idealistic notion that everyone would want to contribute their learning objects without getting paid for them. I don't know about you, but if I'm not getting paid for my work, how am I going to eat? Even Walmart Great Value Wheat Checks requires money to pay for. And it turned out that was really the killer piece of it. So the idea kind of died. You don't hear as much about learning objects now. And then there was this little controversy a few years ago about a little website. It was called teacherspayteachers.com. They figured out the missing piece of learning objects, and that was money. Teachers wanted to get paid for their stuff, but if they could get paid, it was amazing. They were happy, and by the way, it was great, because they didn't want to define what a learning object was. You can buy what you want. You can buy a lesson plan. You can buy a quiz. You can buy a whole unit. And by the way, the more you buy, the better the savings. Sounds kind of like Walmart, doesn't it? And so what happened was, learning objects as was originally conceived didn't happen. But learning objects actually had a life of their own. It was just different than was originally envisioned because we didn't think about what users really needed. And the verdict is it was evolutionary because it's not exactly the learning objects that everyone had in mind. And yet, in the end, it kind of really is. It just had to go through a couple of more mutations. Next one is mobile learning. And mobile learning is relatively new. People started thinking about it 15 years ago. And they said, the idea was I'd be able to pull out my little device, which I turned off so I didn't get attacked in the session, and I would be able to learn from it, which is great in theory. And it was generally a new device, but the problem was, who wants to really sit and take a course? And this is a big screen one. The little iPhone, it's even harder to sit for. And so that's always been a problem. So there's some geographically based opportunities for it, which is kind of cool. But we treat it as if it was the first time we ever dealt with mobile-based learning. But the truth is back in the 1980s, when they had the Walkman, you could put a little cassette tape in there. And I don't know if they did this with the schools, but I do know with training. It was the number 3 most popular medium was the audio tape for training. And what they basically used it for was refresher training. And it was either used for that or the other mobile that we never think about, the cassette player in the car, which of course now is your audio player, that, what Bluetooth connected to your telephone, which has all the audio files on it. But it was a really good device for refresher training for people. And so there was a history there where we actually had done mobile learning. The lessons were generally about 5 to 12 minutes because that's what that attention span that people had. And it was a way to make really productive use of other time. I'm not saying it's the only one. When we start looking at what actually happened with mobile, there were some interesting things. Those of us in the instructional design world that focuses on training were focused on this thing called a performance support system, which the idea was it would be an environment that I could use that would allow me to learn or just simply do in the environment. But one of the keys to electronic performance support was you had to design these really complex applications. And for some reason, when everybody was on the PC, as much as we were really enthusiastic about them, they were extremely expensive to do. And to give you an idea, I did a study many years ago of a project that failed. And they were going to use the ultimate electronic performance support system. The problem was, it goes back to economics, their EPSS was going to cost 3/4 of the project budget. A typical training and documentation effort cost between 10 and 20%. And the reason it was failed is because the board wasn't going to invest that kind of money in it. They would have been willing to go maybe to 25 to 30%, but 75% of the budget they were not willing to go for. So the net result, it didn't happen. One of the things that's really interesting, when you look at some of the apps that have been developed for mobile devices, they look just like electronic performance support systems. So a concept that we've been really promoting for years has been adopted. The problem was we don't work on those projects. It's somebody else who does. That's a concern to me because we could have something really valuable to add, but for some reason we weren't part of that conversation. At the same time, when we look for mobile learning, I think what happens is that most people think of it as this, and there's the tablet, and there are really two types of things. There's learning support that would happen on the phone, and then the tablet, really, many people are using it as a replacement for the desktop, and we're really doing a more formal learning. And then in that case, it's a different kind of mobile learning, and we don't think about that as much. So the verdict on that one is, I think it's still too soon to tell because I think there's more work that's going on in that right now. I'm going to skip forward a little bit. I want to go to MOOCs very quickly. How many people remember 2012? It was the year of the, say it louder, the year of the, okay, it was the year of the MOOC. And what? Well, it may have been, but New York Times pronounced 2012. And everybody was, and to give you an idea how much the hype wagon was going on, the University of Virginia fired its president because they were not getting on, she wasn't getting on MOOCs so fast. They eventually rehired her after a campus protest, and within hours she joined one of the many consortia that was forming like almost instantaneously to offer MOOCs. There were a couple things they forgot. First one was, even though the MOOC was free, they weren't exactly cheap to develop. Duke, who did a MOOC, published a case study on it. It was over $400,000 US to produce that MOOC. Unless you're a really wealthy college, most of us don't have $400,000 to spend on free training that we're giving away to other people, free learning. The second piece was, and this is the more significant one, and I knew this from day one that was going to be a problem, was that the MOOCs only have value to students if they carry academic credit. And as of 2012, or I should say as of 2016, most don't have it. And they certainly aren't recognizing the credits from other universities. The idea is, I take so-and-so's MOOC and I get credit in another university. Because universities just don't like to give credit to other universities' courses. The only way they do is through articulation agreements. We have them in the US, the state of Minnesota. They've mandated that everybody has to accept everyone's credits for all general education courses for the first 2 years. But it wasn't because they did that out of niceness. It was because the state, which funds that system, said you will do this. And if you have other thoughts, you can run your university without our money. For which most of them said, I think I'm okay with this after all. Furthermore, all of those same thoughts were done back 10 years earlier with something called Universitas 21, which was supposed to be a network of the greatest schools in the world. They were going to offer online courses, not for free, but they couldn't even agree to share credits. So when we're talking about the year of the MOOC, the idea is great. The idealism is great. The problem is that we didn't think about the practical issues. And these are really important things, and we ed tech people should know these things. And which brings me to my last one, just very quickly. I think it's still too soon to tell, but MOOCs are going to be, I think, mostly in the continuing education sphere. But I want to get to the last technology, and that's word processing and presentation graphics. How many of you use Microsoft Word? Or something like it? How many people use PowerPoint or something like it? I know that PowerPoint is the technology that all of us love to hate. The problem is it actually is, the reason we love to hate is, A, it's universal, and its use went universal very quickly, and it went exactly as they planned it. People used it first to create their transparencies, and then when the projectors became more popular and available, people started switching to slides. And in fact, when we look at e-learning these days, one of the things that's really notable is that most e-learning is slide-casts. And I know that a lot of people find slide-casts to be, ew, that's disgusting. That's so lazy. I'm going to go back to that ratio again, 40 hours of development to 1 hour of instruction. Most slide-casts, they take as much, 79 hours versus 100, now it's 179 for what's called level 2 e-learning. So immediately, it's a lot, we're talking not just cheaper, a lot cheaper. But here's another thing. Used to be when we did high-end e-learning, we would go to professional talent to narrate it. What's really cool, even if we have crappy voices, most instructional designers are now professional narrators. because we narrate our own slide casts, for which we also are illustrators, designers, and all sorts of other things, and production people, because we can do it ourselves. And it all happened because of PowerPoint and word processing. And what's really interesting is you don't see any research on PowerPoint. Not what it is, not how it's affected. The research that I have seen mostly comes from other fields. There's a lot in communication about how to do a better slide. There's some impact on its impact on audiences. But we don't really research PowerPoint and how it's really changed the culture of instructional design, how it's changed the instruction of teaching, how it's changed the expectations of teaching. How many of you teach and have students that just expect you, as a privilege of instruction, to get a copy of your slides? They never expected that before, get your notes. They just want the slides. I don't know that it helps them, but it certainly makes them reassured and adds to their satisfaction. I don't have a problem with it, but I think it's really interesting. It really has changed that relationship between, in fact, it's what you give your student to say, I'm giving you this. I mean, I would think that it's our wisdom, but no, it's our PowerPoints they want, which is fine. So when we look at PowerPoint, basically word processing and presentation graphics, these were revolutionary. But we actually didn't pay attention to them because they weren't product of our work, they were just a piece of our work. And so what happens is when we're thinking about educational technology, sometimes we let really significant technologies by, and we didn't study them at all. And other ones we get really enthusiastic about, and we don't look at the history. And history actually has something significant to inform. So when we look at technology, instead of being doe-eyed, I think what we can do is look at a system of classifying the technologies. And really, this is kind of adapted from what they do with drug trials. And by the way, back about 100 years ago, there was no regulation of any kind of medicine. And then it turned out, for the kinds of issues that we're dealing with educational technologies, where there's a lot of claims and then they don't live up to them, that's what made that made the medical institutions say, we need to start regulating drugs. Not just for safety, but at least to verify the claims that they're making, which is something we don't hear about anymore because the safety is so widely tested that the claims they also limit the claims that they can make. But the first part is like, when a new technology comes out, it's emerging. So we shouldn't be making broad claims about what its future could be. We can we can state what we anticipate the future might be, but I think rushing to say that something is going to change something or be revolutionary is probably premature. Instead, what we should be doing, for those that like to do this, play with the technology, explore uses. A lot of technologies that we use outside of ed tech have had uses that nobody anticipated. When the telephone was invented, for example, it was only intended to be a business device. Nobody anticipated that teenage girls in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, 80s, and 90s, until they got texting, would find that to be the most important social tool in their lives. But when we do so, we need to let history guide us at this point, because it will at least allow us to see our pitfalls that have happened with predecessor technologies going to affect this one. The next phase is the initial application phase. It's still too soon to know what's going on with it, so we need to continue to experiment. But at this point, we can also do some qualitative studies to identify issues of affecting adoption. When we continue the initial application, the initial validation stage, the first one's application, this is validation. Now we want to do some quantitative studies, if appropriate, to validate the learning effectiveness. It's only after we know that this thing really can work, we know what the implementation issues are, that we should be looking at effectiveness. It's one thing to do a big study of something that's effective for learning, only to find out no one can afford it. I think we should know if you can afford it and if it can be implemented before we waste the money to do a real large-scale study, and also to build up expectations about this. And last is the adoption phase. And this is after we have validated that this is a valid use. Now we can continue and say, all right, just because we validated for use in a particular way doesn't mean we can't find other uses for the technology, and it doesn't mean we can't evolve. Technology is flexible. It is a tool. And that's what's most important. We have to remember, technology is the tool. It's a means, it's not an end. And because our field is educational technology, sometimes we confuse that. And the means are really important because it's not just the technology that's a piece of the means. Our history tells us people are a big piece of this pie. Economics are a big piece of the pie. Practicalities are a big piece of the pie. Trust is a piece of the pie. Repertoire of skills is a piece of the pie. And so merely because someone has something at first glance has the potential to make a change, we need to look at what are the other issues that affect it to see if it really can have a change. So if the next MOOC comes along and they're saying this is going to replace universities, first ask, how are they going to give credit to students that complete it? If we can't, one thing that we know, and this is why academia still survives, that piece of paper is really important. The credential is extremely important. In fact, there's a huge market in credentials right now. It's worrying some people. And to give you an idea, in the US, the number of fields that have required a license has almost doubled in the last 30 years. In some states, you need to be a licensed florist, which has caused some consternation. And by the way, they make the restrictions even higher every time they revise their system. So this isn't a small issue. So when we're looking at technology, we need to look at it not on its own merits, but history has taught us we need to look at it within the whole ecosystem of issues in which it's being implemented. And that's not being pessimistic about the use of technology, as Neil Selwyn says. I think it's just simply being realistic. And in fact, if you can provide people with realistic expectations, I think in the end we can be doing our job quite effectively. Thank you very much.